Hello, EDSP 678Q students, and welcome to this presentation on internal goods, standards of excellence, external goods, and institutional arrangements. This presentation will provide you with language that you can use as you think about the content of your leadership platform. We'll talk about what are the internal goods of the practice of special education leadership? What are the standards of excellence? What are the external goods that accrue to practitioners as a result of their practicing? And what are the institutional arrangements that exist that support the practice? This work comes from two philosophers, McIntyre and Stout, and it was the basis for my doctoral dissertation in 1993, and I have continued to use it with special ed leadership students and principals and teachers ever since. I think it's a solid basis for a way for you to think about what you aspire to be as a special education leadership person. Alistair McIntyre uses this language to talk about the social practices that we have in a society. You can read his definition there. As you can see, it's in very philosophical language. But what it says basically is that practitioners are those people who are involved in a cooperative activity, a socially established cooperative activity that occurs within a historical context. Right now, we are special ed leaders engaging together in a historical activity of special education leadership in a historical context of the second quarter of the 21st century. And you all are in Maryland and the District of Columbia. All of those things influence how you pursue your practice. McIntyre uses the term internal goods to describe those things that we try to accomplish when we pursue standards of excellence. And those standards of excellence are particular to the practice. So where do we find what is good about special education leadership? We'll talk about that in a moment. McIntyre also says that we receive external goods, which are rewards that accrue to us because we do this work. We'll talk about that further in a moment. And then finally, McIntyre uses the term institutional arrangements to describe those things that are in place, those structures and procedures that are in place to situate, support, and sustain the practice of special ed leadership. And of course, that means a system of public education, for example, a school district. And there are many more, which we will discuss further in just a few minutes. Now, the internal goods of a practice are what we aspire to when we act and communicate virtuously using the language of practice. The virtues are those principles of judgment and conduct that urge us forward to the good life. Virtues are moral language that describes what we're trying to do and how we're trying to do it. Okay? We use practical wisdom. We use what we have learned, what we have experienced, what we know to be true about the practice of special ed leadership. Because we have degrees, we have professional learning, we are committed in some way or another to this practice. That gives us practical wisdom. We never have enough practical wisdom. There's always more to learn. We are pursuing justice for students with disabilities in the pursuit of their education. We want students with disabilities to be treated fairly in the context of our society. We want them to have just opportunities. In order to do that, we have to be courageous. We are representing a historically underrepresented group. Not everybody agrees with what we think, and so we have to be courageous in our practice in order to achieve those standards of excellence. We have to be truthful. We have to explain the standards of excellence. We have to encourage people to think in certain ways. We have to convince them. And we do that through truthful argument. We do it with temperance. That is, we are rational, we are passionate, but in an emotionally tempered way. Okay? We are temperate. We see multiple perspectives. We understand them and we negotiate them. This is done professionally. You are participating in a professional practice. And finally, it takes fortitude. We have to be willing to speak truth to power. We have to be willing to fight for those things that we believe in. That takes a certain amount of bravery. Now, internal goods, or the language of internal goods, is expressed in the various standards of excellence that we have. And I've prepared a slide for you here with links to a number of the standards of excellence that are articulated for special ed leadership. There are, of course, the professional standards from CASE for special ed leaders. There are the National Policy Board Professional Standards for Educational Leadership, which is where you will find the leadership part of special ed leadership articulated. The standards are in IDEA. There are things that the field is about that have been institutionalized in IDEA. They've been made formal in IDEA. Least restrictive environment, due process provisions, definitions of disability categories. Those standards of excellence are articulated through IDEA and through various documents that your states or district have prepared. The Maryland Code of Regulations, this handbook that comes from Disability Rights Maryland on special ed rights, and I see it referenced a lot in your State Department materials and website. So this must be a very important document, okay? Seems to be endorsed by the Maryland Department of Education. The Department of Education has a division of early intervention and special ed services, and its website has all sorts of language about what is excellence in special education in Maryland. And DC Public also has a website that talks about what is excellent in special ed in the District of Columbia's public schools, which are primarily governed by federal law, DC being a federal entity. So you kind of loop back up to the IDEA statute and IDEA regulations to extract the language of excellence. What is it that we as special ed leaders are pursuing? What do we think is good about the education of students with disabilities? Not only what is purposeful, but what is practically wise for us to do. That language is embedded in these standards of excellence. And as you work on your platform, you should be looking at these standards to see what it is you're supposed to be doing, what it is you're supposed to be representing, and thinking about, how do I do that? Think about how IETP teams are described in these standards of excellence and what you're doing virtuously, courageously, justly, truthfully in pursuing those the implementation of IEPs in the way they are intended to be implemented. That's standards of excellence, and that is the stuff of your platform. Okay. Now, we also pursue external goods. External goods are what you receive as a result of practicing. You got hired, you receive salary and benefits. You get a certain amount of status, you get recognized, you may have a reputation. There may be some prestige attached to your job. You may have economic and social stability as a result of having this job. You receive those external goods as a result of practicing. You will receive those goods as long as you practice. You may not reach standards of excellence. You may not always practice virtuously. You may do other things, but those goods will still accrue. Right? You're taking this class, and I suspect every now and again it distracts from the time you have to pursue standards of excellence. Your school district has said that's okay. Okay? But you may not be practicing virtuously as a result. Accumulating external goods enables you to practice virtuously. Okay? Puts you in a position where you have a job and you can pursue the standards of excellence of the profession. But it also might hinder the pursuit of internal goods. If you're not, there will be times when there's a dispute over the pursuit of internal goods. And you might be afraid that you will get fired or demoted, or that your status or recognition will diminish, your reputation will be damaged. That threatens your pursuit of internal goods. And so these external goods have an influence on how you do as you move forward in this project of educating children with disabilities. Internal goods and external goods occur within institutional arrangements. Institutional arrangements are ways of situating, supporting, or sustaining a practice. They're the stuff society puts into place to allow the practice to occur. Structures, school districts, states, school districts, schools, classrooms, schedules, teacher contracts, and many, many, many more. All of the structures that Bowman and Deal talk about. Okay, those may be the structures that are put into place. And of course, this varies from place to place. What happens in Montgomery County does not happen in Anne Arundel. What happens in D.C. Public doesn't happen in Prince George's County. What happens in Maryland does not happen in D.C. Public, nor does it happen in North Carolina. There is variability in structures, and how you use them to pursue standards of excellence is very important. Structures come from our ways of creating the implementation of regulations and policies, which are the very formal laws and Board of Education policies that exist. And then there are procedures, ways of doing that your districts create that have the force of law, but they aren't the law. Remember that. They are changeable, and the law is changeable too, but it takes a lot to change a regulation or policy. Changing a procedure is a little bit easier. It's much more localized. Those are institutional arrangements. Compliance is an institutional arrangement. In order to pursue the standards of excellence, of special ed leadership, you have to be in compliance with the law. And if you're not, litigation can occur. Due process hearings can occur. Mediation can occur. Conflict occurs. Okay. The continuum of services, which is embedded in IDEA, is an institutional arrangement. Due process provisions are institutional arrangements. Certification requirements are institutional arrangements that are made to pursue the standards of excellence. In order to pursue the standards of excellence of special education, teachers have to be licensed to do that. Okay? If we are practicing virtuously, justly, truthfully, we know that teachers ought to know a certain amount of stuff and be able to do it before they go into that classroom. And of course, then other problems accrue as a result, right? Funding systems, budgets are institutional arrangements. And of course, they're where many external goods come from. And finally, committees that you form, task forces, IEP teams, the PTA, those are all institutional arrangements, ways of supporting the practice, things that are put in place to allow us to implement special education and related services for students with disabilities in pursuit of those standards of excellence. Institutional arrangements. Now, from my study, just to give you some examples, from my study, I identified these institutional arrangements for the practice of special education administrators back in 1993, and I will argue that they are still very important to special ed leaders today. Establishing access to quality public education for students with disabilities. We do this because we think it's important for students with disabilities to receive a free, appropriate public education, and that has to be of a certain quality. We can argue what quality is, but we establish some rules about what is quality. The definition of appropriate is quality, designed to provide educational benefit in accordance with the student's circumstances. That's the standard of excellence for quality. Now, I happen to think that's not high enough, but that's what we have agreed on. That's the standard of excellence we have agreed on in this historical context right now. Okay? Another internal good for the practice of special ed leadership, something they're about, is fostering acceptance of the diverse needs of students with disabilities, eliminating things like deficit thinking, eliminating the idea that students with disabilities are a burden, that they are unworthy, fostering the notion that we all have diverse needs. Students with disabilities' diverse needs have been overtly identified, and they need to be accepted because they are part of the human continuum. Okay? Students with disabilities are worthy. They have merit. They have opportunities. They have aspirations. And it's up to us to get other people to understand that. First, by establishing access. Secondly, by getting other people to understand that students with disabilities are just like everybody else, and they deserve to be treated well, equitably, fairly, and they deserve to receive those services equitably and fairly. And this applies not only to services, but also to opportunities. Kids with disabilities should not be restricted from opportunities just because of their disability. We ought to make accommodations to try to give them that opportunity. A story about this. My daughter was in the band in high school. And one of her friends was a little boy, a pretty big boy, actually. He was in high school. It was a boy who was in a wheelchair. And he played the drums. And he was a good drummer. And when they got to freshman year, the band was a marching band. And it went on the road to football games. Well, how was her friend, Richard was his name, how was Richard going to get to the football game? He was a drummer in the band, just like the other 9 drummers in the band. The band director didn't want to pay for a bus with a wheelchair lift. So the other kids in the band said, Richard doesn't go, we're not going either. And sure enough, the money appeared for a bus, and Richard wasn't the only kid on it. Okay? Equity and opportunity is part of what we pursue. Another internal good is providing individualized programs and services that value capacity of students with disabilities to avail themselves of increasingly normal opportunities. The history of disability is a growth toward having normal opportunities. We have just finished the Paralympics. The Paralympics has grown up since I wrote this dissertation. And it's because somebody valued the capacity of persons with disabilities to participate in athletic events. Okay? That's what we're about. We're about providing services so kids can participate in social life, educational life, political life, economic life, with as much capacity as they have. They ought to be able to do just what they want to do, just like us. Okay? The internal good that special ed administrators practice is they work with others. Special education leadership is a collaborative activity. And working with others who are interested in educating students with disabilities is important to pursuing those and accomplishing those standards of excellence. And finally, special ed leaders value challenging the system. They aren't people who get along to go along. Okay? The special ed administrators I know who are successful are willing to take on difficult problems and move individuals and systems in productive directions. Temperately, wisely, truthfully, justly, courageously, but moving forward just the same. We'll talk about this on Wednesday, Wednesday the 25th, on Wednesday night at Writing Lab. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.